Okay, well, thanks for joining us. Good evening, and thank you again for being with us this evening. My name is Eric Carpio. I'm the director of the Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center in Fort Garland, Colorado, and I'm also the Deputy Community Museum Officer for History Colorado. We're here this evening with Alyssum Shea. She's the director of El Pueblo History Museum. She and I will be just making sure that all the technology is working. If you have any questions or any issues, please drop it in the chat box and we'll try to take care of that as quickly as we can. We're also joined this evening by our featured speaker, Dr. Karen Roybal. Karen, we're super excited to have you this evening. Tonight's event is part of our Borderlands of Southern Colorado project, a collaboration between 3 of History Colorado's Southern Colorado museums: El Pueblo History Museum, Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, and Trinidad History Museum. The project explores the Borderlands history of Southern Colorado through a variety of exhibits, lectures, educational activities, and now we're excited to add online programming. Tonight's program is the second in a series of online lectures and discussions being offered while our museums are temporarily closed to the public. Definitely want to give a special welcome to those of you who joined us the first week, last week with Dr. Sines. To learn about upcoming lectures, please, we ask you to stick around after the question and answer period, where we have some exciting news about what's coming up in the next several weeks. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd also like to thank the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area for their generous support of the Borderlands of Southern Colorado online lecture series. Without the support of the Heritage Area and other donors, programs like these would not be possible. Tonight's program, of course, is offered on a purely donation basis, so we invite you to support our Borderlands project by clicking on the Colorado Gives link in the chat box. We'll drop that here in just a few minutes. Even a small donation allows us to continue offering quality programs. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Dr. Karen Roybal. Dr. Roybal is a professor of Southwest Studies at Colorado College with a PhD in American Studies from the University of New Mexico. She's the author of Archives of Dispossession, which you can purchase through our 3 museums by calling them directly. I'm just going to put a plug in. We've actually got the book, like I said, at Fort Garland, at Trinidad History Museum, and at El Pueblo History Museum. And we'd be happy to take orders. And we may even ask her a question about the book before she wraps up this evening. Dr. Roybal is here this evening to discuss the history and the impact of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. At the conclusion of her presentation, she'll take questions from the audience. So feel free to type your questions in the chat box at any time. With that, Karen, welcome. We're glad to have you with us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to Eric Carpio for inviting me to give this talk, and also thank you to Zach Workowicz and Alyssum Shea for helping and organizing the talk, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. I'm really thankful that History Colorado has kept the Borderlands lecture series going during this time of uncertainty in our lives. As Eric mentioned, I teach at Colorado College in the Southwest Studies program, and I'm actually a New Mexico native. I grew up in Pecos, New Mexico, and so I have a few folks, I think, from Pecos joining, including my parents, so shout out to them. So I've been able to be part of the Borderlands lecture series in Pueblo, Trinidad, and Fort Garland. And I feel really lucky to have been part of those speaking engagements and now here virtually. So tonight, as Eric mentioned, the title of my talk is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, so no spoilers there. But let me share with you my screen. So I want to give you a brief overview of what I'll be addressing tonight. So first I'm going to talk about the brief history. It's going to be a sort of really brief history of the Mexican-American War and some of the causes and impacts of that war to help contextualize the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And then I'm going to discuss 3 of the key treaty articles that are significant for thinking about Southern Colorado and New Mexico specifically, and also other parts of the West and Southwest. And then I'll conclude by talking about how the treaty continues to impact us today. But tonight I'm actually going to start our discussion about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was originally known as the Treaty of Peace, Friendship, Limits, and Settlement, by taking us to Texas. So if you'll think about your US history classes, whether they were in high school or college, you'll recall that Texas declared its independence from Mexico in 1836, at which time it became the Republic of Texas until 1845. At that point, Texas was annexed into the United States, and this annexation was in part one of the reasons for the start of the Mexican-American War. So prior to the official start of the war, Mexico had threatened to declare war if the United States annexed Texas. So as you might imagine, there was really great tension that existed between the two nations. So from the Texans' perspective, their state included significant portions of what is today New Mexico and Colorado, as well as the western and southern portions of Texas itself. So as you can see on the screen, the area where we have the sort of shaded part here with the lines, this was the disputed territory. And so Texas claimed that the land that they wanted and claimed extended to the Rio Grande River, which as you can see here where my cursor is, the Rio Grande is here. On the other hand, the Mexicans argued that the border only extended to the Nueces River. So the Nueces River is right here. So if the border were indeed the Nueces, we can see sort of that area in between as also sort of another level of disputed territory. Though Mexico had threatened to start the war, it was actually the US that finally officially declared war on Mexico in 1846. The war lasted for 2 years, and it was a very bloody conflict that left at least 63,000 people dead on both sides of the border. On February 2nd, 1848, in Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is a village on the outskirts of Mexico City, representatives of the Republic of Mexico met with representatives of the United States to sign the treaty that was supposed to end the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is seen here, and for those of you who were able to make it to the El Pueblo History Museum at the start of the Borderlands exhibit and subsequent lecture series, you got to actually see the treaty, which is a great neat thing to have seen. But here I'm showing you some pictures from the National Archives just to give you a sense of what the treaty looked like. So on that February 2nd in 1848, representatives from Mexico met with representatives from the US to sign the treaty, and it came after 2 months of negotiations. The treaty is significant because it's the oldest treaty that's still in force between the US and Mexico. But as you might have guessed, based on US imperialist history, the terms under which the treaty came to be were mostly dictated by the US side. So under the treaty agreement, the US ended up paying Mexico $15 million in exchange for the Republic's former northern provinces, which included more than half of Texas, as well as other parts of states that we now know as California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. So that's a substantial amount of land. But what was perhaps the most significant within these terms was that they determined the official border between the US and Mexico, which obviously favored the US and its land base. It's important to acknowledge the significance of the treaty because it provides a foundation for understanding the unequal relations between Mexico and the US that we continue to see today. So if we think about it in terms of the impacts to Mexico, we know that the country lost a substantial amount of land, then a republic, right? It lost 1/3 of its land base, which essentially ensured that Mexico would be an underdeveloped country. Understanding what led up to the Mexican-American War and the subsequent crafting of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it really serves as a stark reminder of the role that American expansionism played in how we currently understand our relationships to the land, and more specifically to the US-Mexico border. So historian Richard Griswold del Castillo asserts that there are, quote, three major issues that shaped relations between the United States and Mexico in the 1840s. The first of which he identifies as American expansionist sentiment as it was reflected in the policies of then President James K. Polk. The second would be domestic political struggles within Mexico and the United States. And then finally, the looming issue is the Texas boundary dispute that I just mentioned. So I want to talk briefly about each of these three areas. So as we think about the idea of American expansionism, it was really guided by the ideological construct of manifest destiny, which essentially allowed English-speaking Anglo-Americans to justify expansion and takeover of what they deemed undiscovered or unsettled lands. They thought they were vacant. And we know that these lands were in fact not undiscovered and not unclaimed, and in fact they were occupied and or claimed by Mexicanos and indigenous peoples. However, colonization efforts that were promoted through the ideals of American expansionism and the construct of manifest destiny allowed settlers to deem it their God-given right to populate and govern land that was west of the Mississippi. Journalist John O'Sullivan first generated the term manifest destiny in 1845 when he wrote in the Democratic Review in favor of the US annexation of Texas. So I have a sample of that Democratic Review here and the section that he wrote on annexation. And I want to share the part where he talks specifically about manifest destiny. So I'll just read this to you quickly. He says, why were other reasoning wanting in favor of now elevating this question of the reception of Texas into the Union out of the lower region of our past party dissensions up to its proper level of a high and broad nationality? It is sure to be found abundantly in the manner in which other nations have undertaken to intrude themselves into it. Between us and the proper parties to the case, in a spirit of hostile interference against us, for the avowed object of thwarting our policy and hampering our power, limiting our greatness, and checking the fulfillment of our manifest destiny, to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. So we can already see with John O'Sullivan's intentions in terms of thinking about manifest destiny, one, that it was a God-given right. Second, we see sort of early indications of capitalism beginning to develop. So this idea of American expansionism and progress was perpetuated well into the later 19th century. I'm sure many of you have seen the famous 1872 painting by John Gast that's entitled American Progress that I have up on the screen. It's really a visual depiction of what O'Sullivan and others like him envisioned in their push to move west. So you can literally see in this image the Anglo settlers making their way west. You can see the indigenous people sort of being pushed off to the side. And then this image, or this sort of angelic image that really sort of symbolized this idea of divine providence, manifest destiny. So President James K. Polk, as I mentioned earlier, played a significant role in what eventually led to the Mexican-American War, and he was a staunch supporter of westward expansion. So I want to move to Del Castillo's second point, or the issue that he identified, which were those domestic political struggles within Mexico and the US. While Polk and his Democratic supporters encouraged American expansionism into the West and Southwest, Mexico was preparing itself for battle. And in fact, they believed that they could defeat the US. However, another problem arose with time to determine how Mexican officials would negotiate the treaty. It's important to note that Mexican politics at this time were unsettled at best. Essentially what happens is that there were many overthrows or multiple overthrows of the government in Mexico, which made any sort of agreement very difficult. There were some Mexican politicians, however, who supported the treaty and hoped that with the treaty would come a reunification of Mexico's government. And then the final issue that Del Castillo identified was the Texas boundary dispute. And this was definitely one of the major factors that caused the Mexican-American War. And it was that difference in opinion between over the boundaries of Texas, specifically that Rio Grande boundary. While the Texans had won their independence in 1836, Mexico never recognized claims by the Texans of their independence. Through annexation, the US acquired the land that they claimed was part of Texas, which meant that the Rio Grande and not the Nueces River served as the officially recognized boundary. So treaty negotiations were in large part guided by Nicholas Petrus, who's seen here. He was then the chief clerk for the US Department of State, and he actually worked under James Buchanan. But Trist was sent to Mexico by President Polk to negotiate the treaty in 1847. However, President Polk became frustrated with Trist's handling of the negotiations, and his argument was that he thought Trist was being too lenient with Mexican officials. The president went so far as to order Trist back to the US and to halt all negotiations immediately. And in an act of defiance, Trist ignored the president's dispatch because he felt that he was close to an agreement with Mexican officials, and he continued to negotiate. So if you'll recall, when I showed you the picture of the treaty, on the right-hand side, I showed you the signed treaty, and it was Nicholas Trist's signature on there. So in his act of defiance, he got the treaty done. But as you can imagine, President Polk was not very happy with him, and so he ends up getting fired when he comes back to the US. So I'll do a quick little recap here. Up to this point, we know that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. Now it's been 172 years ago, and it was signed on February 2nd, 1848, after 2 months of negotiation. We know that the treaty ended the US-Mexico War. We know that a new border was established along the Rio Grande, and we know that 1/3 of Mexico's territory was ceded to the US. But the question remains, right? What happened to the Mexicanos who are living in the disputed territory? Well, when the treaty was signed, some 75 to 100,000 Mexicans remained in what we now know as the US Southwest. So the question became, what do we do with these Mexicanos? Based on Treaty Article 9, some Mexicanos became US citizens, but of course without many of the rights that were afforded to US citizens. Instead, Mexicanos were given 3 options. They could, 1, remove themselves from the US, 2, they could become permanent resident aliens, or 3, they could elect to become US citizens 1 year after the signing of the treaty. But as you might guess, these options were not acceptable to Mexico. So the Querétaro Protocol was signed 3 months later in May 30th of 1848, which essentially amended the citizenship issues and specified that Mexicans would become US citizens as quickly as possible, so not after that 1-year period. So with these newly sanctioned Mexican Americans, they really had nominal protection as US citizens, and then they faced other issues. And so you'll notice that last bullet point on this slide talks about the race problem. And so this race problem emerged throughout the nation, really, but you may be familiar with the name John C. Calhoun, who was then a South Carolina senator. He was one of the people who objected to the possible incorporations of Mexicans into the Union. And he argued that Mexicans represented a mixture of what he called impure races, not even as good as the Cherokees or Choctaws. He asked, and I'm quoting him here, "Can we incorporate a people so dissimilar to us in every respect, so little qualified for free and popular government, without certain destruction to our political institutions," end quote. So many settlers shared the same sentiments as Calhoun, which resulted in increased racial tension and hostility against Mexicans. They were essentially deemed inferior to Anglo-Americans. We know that this imposed inferiority didn't only occur after the Mexican-American War and the subsequent signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but this period surely ushered in more hostility to Mexican-Americans. So in addition to these issues, I also wanted to point out and discuss the altered legal and political landscape with which Mexicanos were faced. And first, I want to talk about the loss of political power, because essentially when the treaty was signed, Mexicanos lost their political power and it was reneged, whereas they had maintained political control under Mexico. Mexican Americans were now subject to Anglo males' assumed dominance in matters of politics. So they really became politically disenfranchised, and Mexicans were removed from political positions. It was a little bit different in terms of Mexicano elites, at least for portion of the time, because Mexicano elites lost their political positions later. And in New Mexico, for example, many Hispanos and Mexicanos maintained their political power for much longer than their counterparts in California, but they nonetheless eventually lost their power, elite status or not. The next issue is segregation. So the influx of Anglo settlers also led to Mexican segregation into what we might now identify as barrios. But those barrios at once became a place to which the quote unquote inferior Mexican population was regulated, but it was also a place where Mexicanos could have some semblance of community. And then there was a shift in the labor force. So Mexican Americans who had previously been employed as blacksmiths, saddle makers, leather workers, cowboys, they were all no longer needed, and their positions were considered obsolete in the new political economy that defined the 19th century once US imposition occurred. And then of course we have to think about identity at this particular moment in time. Historian David Gutierrez suggests that many Mexicans claimed a white ethnic identity in order to be part of the racialized hierarchy. And this was common, especially with elite Mexicanos and Hispanos who claimed to be gente de razón or to have sangre azul or pure Spanish blood, which was used to distinguish themselves from lower class Mexicans and also from native peoples. But I also want to reiterate, so that this idea of racial and class hierarchies also existed in colonial society, right? There was a hierarchical system based on economics. So if we think about, for instance, the peón and patrón system, that was clearly based on economics, on class, and even race, I would argue. And then finally, Mexicanos were subjected to dispossession and changing land laws. So life changed from a pastoral one that was based on agriculture to a capitalist view. So in California, for instance, the 1849 gold rush influenced many Anglo settlers to make their way west, and they encroached on Mexican American communities. And I have an excerpt from Article 10 of the treaty because it was supposed to protect Mexican land grants, which much of, at least Northern California in particular, had a number of Mexican land grants. And so I'm just going to read you that excerpt. It stipulated that, quote, all grants made by the Mexican government or by the competent authorities in territories previously appertaining to Mexico shall be respected as valid to the same extent that the same grants would be valid if the said territories had remained within the limits of Mexico, end quote. So I'm going to come back to Article 10 in just a moment, but first I want to emphasize that Mexicanos didn't sit back idly as all of these changes were happening. They did enact resistance efforts. And this is where I think we first can think about the idea of la raza sort of developing, right? We sort of associate that with the 1960s, but I think we can also think about it even then in the 19th century. Because those barrio communities that I mentioned did maintain their traditional practices, right? They did have some sense of community there. Mutualistas were formed, so mutual aid groups in which they were able to help one another. And then newspapers developed in the 19th century. Many of them were Spanish language papers that communicated the local and national happenings in Spanish. So I want to go back to the land issues and specifically to that Article 10 of the treaty, because if this article was indeed upheld, then Mexicanos could maintain ownership of their lands and these were lands that had been granted to them either under Spanish or Mexican law. The US Senate, however, didn't want to ratify this clause of the treaty. And you can probably guess why, right? The Senate feared that Article 10 would throw into question land titles in Texas. So as you can think about that area of Texas that was part of the disputed territory, if you remember from the beginning of the talk. So Texas had been annexed by the US before the Mexican-American War. So this was a predicament in which the US didn't want to find itself. So the state simply deleted, or the Senate, excuse me, simply deleted Article 10 from the treaty. At that time, James Buchanan was the Secretary of State, and he tried to explain to Mexican officials that Article 10 was unnecessary because he said, and I'm quoting him here, the present treaty provides amply and specifically in its 8th and 9th articles for the security of property of every kind belonging to Mexican grants or otherwise in the acquired territory, end quote. So I wanted to share with you briefly the gist of Articles 8 and 9 to give you some context, right? So we can better understand, why was Buchanan making this argument? Did they indeed, in fact, serve as a stand-in for Article 10? So I won't read this to you in its entirety, but essentially Article 8 talks about the citizenship issues that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So Mexicanos could be free to continue where they reside. They could remove themselves at any time to the Mexican Republic, but they would retain their property in which they possess in the said territories or disposing thereof. And so I wanted to read that part. And then down at the bottom in that last section, in the said territories, property of every kind now belonging to Mexicans not established there shall be inviolably respected. The present owners, the heirs of these, and all Mexicans may hereafter acquire said property by contract, shall enjoy with respect to its guarantees equally ample as if the same belonged to citizens of the United States. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, Article 9 reads, and I'm going to read this one in its entirety. The Mexicans who in the territories aforesaid shall not preserve the character of citizens of the Mexican Republic, conformably with what is stipulated in the preceding article, shall be incorporated into the Union of the United States and be admitted at the proper time to be judged of by the Congress of the United States to the enjoyment of all rights of citizens of the United States according to the principles of the Constitution, and in the meantime shall be maintained and protected in the free enjoyment of their liberty and property and secured in free exercise of their religion without restriction. And so I wanted to emphasize those two articles because they do indeed talk about property, right? But Article 10, which ends up getting stricken from the treaty, is the one that talks about land grants specifically, right? So there is, I think, and you'll see as we get through the talk a little bit more, I think a big difference in the way that land grants were conceptualized, even though they are property, right? So I'm not going to reread Article 10 to you, but I want to emphasize that first part of the article, which is what I showed earlier, that says all grants of land made by the Mexican government or by the competent authorities in territories previously appertaining to Mexico and remaining for the future within the limits of the United States shall be respected as valid to the same extent that the same grants would be valid to the said territories had they remained within the limits of Mexico. So that's important. So the guarantee by Buchanan that Articles 8 and 9 would be adhered to would be an adequate substitute for Article 10 was, as we know, especially those of you who are land grant heirs, is much more complex than that. And in part, this was because when Article 10 was removed in 1848, in 1849, gold rush migrants rushed to California and they encroached or squatted on California land grants. They wanted the US government to liberate the land. So in response, Congress passed the Land Act of 1851. So this is the same year that San Luis was established. And this law was one in which a board of land commissioners was established to adjudicate the validity of Mexican land grants in California specifically. So the Land Grant Commission was instructed to follow the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the law of nations, Mexican and Spanish laws, and decisions made by the US Supreme Court. And then subsequently, after this 1851 law, the Office of the Surveyor General was established in 1854, and then the Court of Private Land Claims in 1891. But the 1851 law required Mexicano land grant heirs to provide evidence of their land titles within 2 years of their property, or it would become public domain or quote unquote liberated, as it was termed. So this procedure in some ways sounds just, especially since it appears to uphold property protections, but what was the issue? So the determinants for a successful land claim under US law were not in many ways on par with Mexican law and even Spanish law before that, which was deeply embedded in a feudal economic system. So under Mexican law, as historian David Gutierrez reminds us, quote, procedures regulating property ownership, boundaries, and transfers were largely based on tradition and respect for authority. So if you've heard any of my other talks for History Colorado, I've noted how it was common for Mexicanos to mark property boundaries with what we might label as ephemeral markers, so rocks, trees, animal skulls, etc. But the US legal system deemed this method too casual when it came to private property declarations. But perhaps most importantly is that the majority of land grants in New Mexico and Texas were deemed what they call imperfect, which means that grantees and land claimants had not previously fulfilled Mexican regulations for legal land ownership. Richard Griswold del Castillo says, quote, the US government inherited the Mexican government's sovereignty and thereby the right to complete the process of land confirmation, end quote. And this really posed a huge problem for Mexican landholders who would be subjected to new US laws and customs, which were grounded in mercantilism and a market economy. So put plainly, they were grounded in capitalism, and that's still the system that we have today. Many of the grants were private. However, many of the land grants in New Mexico and the San Luis grant in Southern Colorado were communal grants, and they were rooted in rural community-based practices. The land was used to provide sustenance, and often land was deemed common when it was maybe too mountainous, or it was densely wooded, maybe it was too wet or too dry. And this land might not have been ideal for cultivation, but it was ideal for hunting, harvesting timber, or even grazing. So this idea was a much different conception of the land than the capitalist understanding of the land that was developing across the West and Southwest. The Office of the Surveyor General the Office of the Surveyor General was created to ensure that all of these grants would be protected, but in reality, what happened was the Surveyor General was limited to determining the size and the legitimacy of original grants and did not investigate how the grants would be subdivided, or how they were subdivided, under Mexican law, usage, or custom. So put yourself in the position of Mexicanos at this time. Would you trust the US government? Probably not, right? Plus, there were a number of other factors to consider. First, the Mexican legal system was dictated by codes and laws that were interpreted based on local custom and usage, as I mentioned earlier. Mexican property law held, and to some extent still holds, that land grants are based on what's called the ejido cooperative system, so common lands couldn't be sold. In addition, the court system in Mexico wasn't as significant as it became in the US. Under US law, the system differed completely. Boundaries were determined through cartography and surveying, so essentially the system that we still have in place today. Second, the legal changes that were occurring were detrimental to Mexicanos who were forced into US legal offices in which they had to provide depositions along with legal documents such as property deeds, surveys, and titles to have their land confirmed. And some of the major issues here were translation. Most Mexicanos spoke Spanish, so they were reliant on Anglo translators. And second, some didn't have the legal documents or simply didn't want to give them up, and with good reason. Third, many Mexicanos could not afford the legal fees associated with this process, nor could they afford the newly imposed property taxes. So under the Mexican system, they taxed the goods produced on the land, but not the land itself. So that was a huge change. And then finally, because of the shifting economy, ranchos couldn't be maintained. And so similar to what we're seeing today with the coronavirus, cattle prices dropped significantly. So Mexicanos were forced to sell their land, and often for a much lower value than what the land was actually worth. So let's talk a little bit about the impacts of the treaty today. As land grant heirs in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado will tell you, the issues stemming from the removal of Article 10 of the treaty persist today. And really, I would argue that Articles 8 and 9, which indicated that Mexican Americans would be treated fairly and on the same level as Anglo-Americans, continue to impact how they're treated today, and other minorities as well. For land grant heirs, legal scholars, and others who continue to fight for their land rights, one of the major arguments is that the US did not fulfill its obligation under the treaty in matters of property protection provisions. Many of the heirs point out that they were not awarded the full amount of acreage that should have been conferred. They also raised the issue of whether land that has been confirmed was confirmed to the rightful owners or if it was awarded at all. And as we think about communal grants, the issue becomes the question of ownership. Many times heirs didn't have a title for the common land, and because of the legalese in the treaty, they were deemed unassigned lands, and thus the title would be retained by the sovereign, which then would be the US. In what is now Colorado, many of the grants on the Eastern Plains were turned over to the US government after the signing of the treaty, and then adjudicated by the claims courts later. Historian Maria Montoya writes in depth about the Maxwell land grant, and I highly recommend her book. And that grant was upheld in full. Like land grants in New Mexico, other land grants like the Nolan, the Vigil St. Vrain grants, they were reduced in size. The Conejos grant remained in the court for years, and the Sangre de Cristo grant was confirmed, but it's undergone decades of litigation. In 2004, the US General Accounting Office, better known as the GAO, created a report in which they examined the claims of land grant heirs in New Mexico. And the GAO determined that the US met constitutional due process requirements, and they followed the requirements of implementing and carrying out statutes that were completed by the SGO and the Court of Private Land Claims. However, they also note that the processes were inefficient and they created extreme hardships for grantees for the reasons I listed earlier. In addition, the GAO did find that claimants lost, and I'm quoting from their report here, substantially more acreage after the confirmation process, end quote. So this finding really justifies the claims by land grant heirs to say, hey, we did lose our land, right? Whether or not we lost it in its entirety, we did lose our land. So today, land grant communities continue to fight for land reclamation. And a prime example are our neighbors in San Luis who can speak directly to the impacts of land loss and access to common land that's part of the Sangre de Cristo grant. In 2006, the New Mexico Land Grant Council was created by the New Mexico State Legislature, and the Land Grant Council was created in part to establish a land grant support system to provide advice and assistance to land grants and to serve as a liaison between land grants and the federal, state, and local government. So the creation of the Land Grant Council is significant, though it certainly only addresses one repercussion of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So I'm going to pause here. I've given you a large amount of information to process, but I hope that this talk has provided some foundation for understanding some of the significant aspects of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Karen. That was really great. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to go through these in a way that maybe organizes them in somehow. The first question we have is from Jason. He asks, did the church resist the push toward Protestantism and the influx of non-Catholics into New Mexico, Colorado territories fueled by manifest destiny after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo?
Well, I'm certainly not a scholar of religion, but I can say that there was definitely, I think on both sides, so we have to think there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, especially from Protestants, but also I would imagine, right, that the reverse was true, so that there was also anti-Protestant sort of sentiment from the Catholic Church as well. But I also want to point out that we have to think about histories of colonialism, right? And we have to remember that the Spanish and Franciscan missionaries also tried to convert native peoples, right? And so the sort of discussion about Protestantism and Catholicism is an interesting one because we have to think about the ways in which other religions sort of imposed, right, their religious domination, or at least their ideologies on others. So I would say that there was certainly some of that pushback there from the Catholic Church.
So Nathan asked if you could expand a little bit more on your earlier mention about Mexico threatening to start the war.
Yeah, I think Mexico just they believed, right, that they had the manpower to win the war, and so they were sort of fearless in that way. But when it came down to it, right, that's not what happened. I'm not sure how much more detail to provide there, but I think that as we think about sort of these two, you know, the U.S. and Mexico finally coming together, right, that it was definitely in the interest of the U.S. To start and to win the war because of that huge amount of land that was at stake.
So I'm going to ask you maybe to talk a little bit about your other research. And as a matter of fact, there are several questions around this. One question someone asked, didn't women have more rights at the time in Mexico than women in the United States? But then someone else asked later, did women have political rights or was it just economic rights that was superior to that in the United States? Can you talk about that and maybe connect that to what we know as your other research?
So that question ties directly to my book that Eric mentioned. And I write specifically about women with regards to property ownership and loss. And definitely under Mexican civil law, women had more rights in terms of property ownership. So it didn't necessarily extend into political rights in the sense that we think about political rights now, but because land was also tied to politics, I would say in that regard, yes. So Mexican women could buy, inherit, and sell property on their own under Mexican civil law. And once the US took over, that changed for Mexicanas. So there's a real irony, right, in thinking about many critics at that time in the 19th century deemed Mexican law backwards, but really it was progressive for women because they could maintain their own sort of management of their own property. And that wasn't the case in the US. And in fact, Mexican women, it was a really detrimental impact to Mexican women is if we think about the impacts of the treaty, because then they were reliant on male members of their household to represent them in court. So I do go into, in my book, I go into specific archives, into the Spanish archives of New Mexico, and look at depositions provided by, I was looking for depositions provided by women. And I looked at over 1,000 depositions and only 2 were provided by women, which isn't necessarily surprising, but it points to the fact that they were then reliant on male members of their household to essentially represent them in court.
There was another question. Someone is asking, let's see, were Native Americans accounted for by either party in the signing of the treaty?
I don't think so. I think that, and so I do recommend one of my colleagues former colleagues from UNM, Jacobo Baca, writes specifically about the Native peoples in New Mexico and sort of the impacts that the treaty had on the Native peoples. But I think at that time, if we think about race relations, they were very complex. So that is to say, right, that even though Mexicanos and Native peoples were living sort of together in the same spaces, that there was still this hierarchy that existed, and especially with the elite class. I think the lower class Mexicanos and Native peoples probably banded together more frequently. But I would say that they weren't necessarily considered, right, as we think about the treaty negotiations.
Let's see, Shelley asks, regarding some of the land grant issues, how does eminent domain work with the land grants? Has it been used on lands for things like railroads or mineral or water extraction or things like that?
I think probably more so like in California that happened. There are a number of cases in California in which litigation lasted for 17 years, for instance. And so I think that Mexicanos tried to fight against that, but when eminent domain happens, right, I mean, there's really nothing you can do. And so when this is when the idea of the setting of boundaries becomes significant, right? Because if you're pushed off your land, then you really don't have a choice, and then you can't afford the legal representation. So I think that it was used in areas like that where, you know, they wanted to do that, the transcontinental railway that extended from coast to coast.
So you mentioned California. Chris asks, curious why some land grants had a communal nature. Was that just in this area, Colorado, New Mexico, or did that also, was that also present in California?
There were some, I think there were more private land grants in California for sure. We hear more about the communal land grants in this area. And in part, many of the land grants in California were the California elites who had received those grants for their service to the military. And essentially they became the rancheros who were sort of dictating what was happening in Mexico. But here we hear more about the common lands because people were using the land for sustenance, right, to survive. And that's still even the case today with the Sangre de Cristo land grant, right, that they have been fighting for decades for access to those common lands for grazing and hunting and all of those things that a community like that needs.
So Al asks and wonders whether relations between the United States and Mexico had improved a few years later by the time of the Gadsden Purchase.
I guess I would say they sort of improved, but I think we still see, you know, sort of the remnants of the ways in which the US sort of positioned itself, right? And also the ways in which it helped to reinforce the position of Mexico as always reliant, right? I mean, I was talking about the treaty, but we can also think about, you know, even, you know, fast forward to the 90s when NAFTA, right, was created. I mean, it's sort of the same situation. So in many ways, history is cyclical, right? It's just kind of under a different guise.
So in that respect, and maybe you just answered it, but we've got a question asking how has the treaty and historical relations impact today's relations with both Mexican Americans and indigenous peoples and their relationship with the United States?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the relations are still complex, right? So if we think about the dispossession of lands, if we really wanted to think about dispossession, right, that we should return all the lands, right? And the indigenous peoples are the true owners and stewards of the land. But I would say, right, that there has been greater levels of relations between them. And so I think that's a significant change. But the race relations are still super complex, I would say.
Charlene asks, can you talk about the major reasons why Mexico may have lost the war?
I think in part it was the political situation there, right? Because there was so much happening in terms of like overthrow, people wanting power, right? So overthrowing a president, for instance. And so that there's a lot of dissension, right, within Mexico itself. And I think that was probably one of the issues at stake there.
Mm-hmm. So we have an interesting question from Nathan. He asked, can you speak on rumors that Mexico had considered selling California to Britain in order to expand their territory beyond modern day Oregon and Washington?
I don't know that I can necessarily speak to that, but I think, in terms of thinking about California was also unique, right? I've been talking about Texas a lot here because that was a significant land base, but also so was California. And part of why Polk was upset, for instance, with Trist was because he wanted Baja California as well. And the US only got Alta California, right? So what we now know as California. But I don't know necessarily about the rumors that Mexico is going to sell it to Britain.
Yeah. Going back to some of your prior research, Carmen is asking, is it true that many Anglos in the United States married Mexicana landowners in order to become landowners themselves?
Yes, and that happened throughout the Southwest, right? So you see evidence of that in Texas, California, New Mexico, and even in Arizona. There's actually a really interesting case of a gentleman in Arizona, we may be familiar with it, the Baron of Arizona, who actually went so far as to create a fictitious Mexican identity for this woman who he married, who claimed was a grantee. And there's still speculation about whether or not this woman was indigenous, was she Anglo, but this gentleman went so far as to make a sort of fake Mexican identity for her in order to claim a substantial amount of land, and it was the biggest fraudulent case. But it was very common for Anglo-Americans to come west and marry into Mexican families. It was also common for Mexican elites to marry their daughters off to Anglos because they knew that if they could do that, right, they were already sort of forecasting what was going to happen, right, that they were probably going to lose their land. So how can I maintain this? Well, if I marry my daughter off to this entrepreneur, then perhaps our family can still maintain the land.
All right. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. We've got time maybe just for one or two more questions. Jessica asks, is the treaty a major reason why many Mexican Americans, especially in New Mexico, identify as Spanish or Hispano? Well, there's a question for you.
I think in part it influenced very, very highly why that happened, right? There's a number of scholars who write about this idea of the Spanish fantasy heritage. And in part, right, it was because of that sort of status, whether that was political status, right, or sort of racial, ethnic status. But I think that we could definitely argue that the treaty sort of influenced that identification for sure.
Okay. I think those are many of the questions. Is there anything, Karen, that maybe wasn't asked that you would like to finish up with some regarding any closing thoughts or anything?
Yeah, I'll just say that my research in this area, so in the book that I wrote, the treaty, I don't talk about the Mexican legal system as much as I did tonight, but I think it's important to understand, right, what was going on in Mexico. But I also think that it's important to think about what is happening today as well. And much of my research has been informed by the land grant communities in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, who I've worked with since I was in graduate school. And they've shared a significant amount of knowledge with me. So really, they're my teachers as well. So I want to also attribute some of this research to them, because if it weren't for those opportunities to work with the community, I wouldn't have started this project to begin with. But we often don't get to learn about our own history. And so it's significant that we continue to seek out these opportunities and the sources that do address these histories that impact our identities today.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to have you at any of our community museums, and you're welcome back anytime, either in person or virtually. So thanks for your time this evening. Also want to thank everyone online who was able to join us tonight. Again, you can learn more about Dr. Roybal's research by checking out Archives of Dispossession at any of our community museum gift shops. Again, thank you to the Sangre de Cristo National Heritage Area and all of our donors for supporting public programming. And in order to learn more about upcoming events, please, we would encourage you to follow El Pueblo History Museum, Fort Garland Museum and Cultural Center, or Trinidad History Museum online and on social media. Just a couple of announcements. We do want to share some of our upcoming programs. In our Borderlands series, next Thursday, April 23rd, we've got a timely topic. We'll be joined by the director of the Santa Fe Public Library, Maria Sanchez Tucker, who will discuss the Spanish influenza of 1918 and its impact specifically on southern Colorado. The following week, about 3 or 4 days before Cinco de Mayo, Dr. David Hayes Bautista, professor of public health at UCLA, will join us to shed some light on the true origins of Cinco de Mayo and the Battle of Puebla. We have another really special event coming up that I'd like to put a plug in for as well on our next slide. On Tuesday, April 28th at 1 p.m., History Colorado will be offering a special program. It's called Insights and In Person, Connecting with the Truths of the Espinosa Brothers Saga. If you're familiar with Southern Colorado history, you may know or think you know some of the story of the Espinosa brothers. The program will dive deep into both the facts and myths surrounding the history of the Espinosa brothers. The program starts with a YouTube video that you can watch at your leisure about the story of the many artifacts in the History Colorado collection, including 2 of the revolvers that are claimed to have belonged to the Espinosa brothers. After you watch the video, join us on the 28th at 1 o'clock Mountain Time for a live discussion with a couple of our curators, James Peterson and Matt Lopez, as well as historian and writer Virginia Sanchez. This is a program you're not going to want to miss. Again, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again, and have a good evening.